My dad looked me straight in the eye and said, "You stole a child that was never yours." Then he blocked my number, my Facebook, and told the rest of the family to do the same. 5 years later, after his stroke, they suddenly wanted to meet my daughter, but they had no idea who her real grandfather was, and when I told them, it shut the room down. Hey there, welcome to today's story. Wherever you are, doing dishes, going for a walk, or just taking a break, I invite you to listen closely because this one's powerful. Imagine adopting a baby out of pure love, only to have your own family cut you off completely. No calls, no visits, just silence. But what if, years later, they came crawling back, begging to meet the child they once rejected? Have you ever felt pushed aside by the people who were supposed to love you most? If so, you might find a piece of yourself in today's story. Stick around to see how one woman turned that heartbreak into strength and delivered the kind of quiet justice that hits harder than revenge. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. It helps me bring more true, emotional stories straight to you. Let's dive in.
My name's Ava. I'm 35, and if you met me today, you'd probably never guess the world I came from. These days, I live in a little craftsman house tucked beneath the Oregon pines. I'm an art therapist. I drink herbal tea. I make homemade Play-Doh. My daughter Zoe thinks I'm magic because I can draw unicorns without looking at a picture. We bake cookies on rainy days, we sing in the car, and she calls me Mama like it's the most natural thing in the world. But there was a time I didn't believe I deserved any of this. I was born into a household where love came with conditions, and silence was the currency of peace. My parents are what you'd call strict traditionalists. If it wasn't in the Bible, it didn't happen. And if it was in the Bible, it was cherry-picked, distorted, and used as a weapon, especially against women. Growing up, I wasn't allowed to watch TV. We didn't have internet until I was almost 16, and even then, the parental controls were so tight that I couldn't even Google the word biology for a school paper. I wore long skirts, covered my shoulders year-round, and had my first real haircut at 17, one that still made me look too worldly, according to my mom. Boys, off limits. I was warned that even thinking about romance would make me impure. I still remember being grounded for an entire summer just because a boy passed me a note in Algebra 2 that said I had nice handwriting. No joke. Church wasn't just on Sundays. It was Tuesday night youth group, Wednesday night Bible study, Friday volunteer prep, and Saturday rehearsals for Sunday service. Our entire identity was built around image, not faith. It wasn't about being good, it was about appearing godly. And in that framework, a woman's worth boiled down to 3 things: obedience, fertility, and silence. I tried to check all the boxes. I was obedient, I didn't rebel, I didn't drink, I didn't party, I followed all the rules. But the one thing I couldn't control, the one thing that would brand me as less than, was the fact that I couldn't have children. At 30, after years of hormonal injections, invasive tests, and 2 miscarriages that still haunt me in quiet moments, a doctor looked me in the eye and said, "Ava, it's time to start thinking about other options." I nodded, I smiled, I walked out of the clinic like I was made of steel. Then I sat in my car with the AC on full blast, gripping the steering wheel so hard I thought it might snap off. I couldn't cry, I couldn't scream, I just sat there, frozen, as the weight of that sentence sunk in. Not just what it meant for my body, but what it meant for my worth in the eyes of my family. My parents already saw me as a disappointment. I hadn't married right after college like my sister, I'd chosen art therapy over accounting, I'd rented instead of buying. This news would only reinforce what they already believed, that I was broken. But here's the truth I didn't realize at the time. I wasn't broken. I was open. And 6 months later, when I met Zoe, everything changed. Zoe was 5 months old when I got the call that changed my life. Her biological mother had voluntarily surrendered custody after a long, painful battle with addiction. The kind of addiction that leaves no space for stability, no safe place for a child. The caseworker said she'd tried, but relapsed again, this time badly. There was no father listed, no relative stepped up. For 42 days, Zoe had bounced through emergency placements like a pinball in the system, too young to understand, too quiet to be noticed. The moment I saw her file, something inside me stirred. I don't mean some cheesy Hallmark movie instant connection. I mean a knowing, a calm certainty that didn't come from logic or planning, but from somewhere deeper. I stared at her photo, a chubby-cheeked little girl wrapped in a hospital blanket, eyes wide, like she was already trying to make sense of the world, and I just knew she was mine. Meeting her for the first time was quiet, strangely still. The foster mother who'd been taking care of her passed her over gently, and I remember my arms felt too clumsy, too shaky, like I wasn't qualified to hold something so delicate. But Zoe didn't cry. She didn't even blink. She just looked at me, long and slow, like she was studying my face to decide if she could trust it. I sat down in the corner of the room and held her for nearly an hour. She didn't squirm, she didn't fall asleep. She just stayed there, one little hand curled in the fabric of my shirt, her head tucked into my collarbone like we'd done this 100 times before. That night, I bought a crib off Craigslist for $40 and emailed the adoption agency with 5 words that still make me emotional to type. I want to start paperwork. I was broke, I was scared, but I was certain. Foster to adopt isn't glamorous. It's not a photo album and matching pajamas. It's visits from caseworkers who knock during dinner. It's family court dates. It's paperwork so dense it makes your brain melt. It's late-night Google searches about trauma-informed attachment. It's wiping away vomit and questioning if you're enough. And I would do it all again. Over the next few months, I became mama in all the quiet ways that matter. I learned how to hold her through her night terrors, how to feed her without overwhelming her, how to sing just the right lullaby that helped her sleep, one I made up myself and still hum sometimes when I'm folding laundry. And slowly, the paperwork caught up to the love. At the 6-month mark, the judge signed off on the final adoption decree. I walked out of the courthouse holding Zoe's hand, and she smiled up at me with this dimple that still makes my heart hurt. She was mine. Legally, emotionally, spiritually, she'd always been mine. That night, I did something I hadn't planned. I sent my parents a photo. No caption, no announcement, just a single image. Zoe asleep on my chest in a yellow onesie, both of us wrapped in the soft blue blanket my grandmother crocheted for me when I was born. At first, I thought maybe they'd see the picture and feel something real. Maybe they'd recognize the love, the peace. Maybe they'd even call to say something kind. I wasn't expecting fanfare, but I hoped they'd understand. The call came a few hours later. I'd barely said hello before my dad's voice crashed through the line like a wrecking ball. The words were cruel, sharp, practiced almost, as if he'd rehearsed them. I remember the phrase, "You stole a child." Then, "You're trying to replace your broken womb." And then, the one that broke me, "She's not your blood, and she never will be." In the background, I heard my mother whispering, sobbing really, saying over and over, "What will the church say? What will the church say?" Not, "How is she?" Not, "Is she safe?" Not, "Do you love her?" Just shame, just scandal, just silence. I stared at the wall in my living room for a full minute after my dad hung up. The photo I'd just taken, the one I thought might bring us together, was still open on my phone. I looked at it again, at her tiny hand gripping the edge of my shirt, at the peace on her face. And then my phone started lighting up. First, it was my aunt, the one who sends out Bible verses in the family group chat every morning. "You went too far." Then my cousin, the one who just had her second baby shower, complete with matching cupcakes and a gender reveal smoke bomb. This isn't God's plan. Then my sister. "You're selfish. You always make everything about you." Each message hit like a slap. Not because I believed them, but because deep down, some part of me wanted them to be better, to rise to the occasion, to surprise me. Instead, they proved everything I feared was true. By midnight, I was blocked from the group chat. My dad removed me from his Facebook friends list. My mother didn't reply to my follow-up email. Even my younger brother, who once told me I was his role model, sent a single sentence: "You're not part of this family anymore." And just like that, I was out. No trial, no explanation, no debate. I was deleted. Erased, cut out like a bad thread from a family tapestry that only looked seamless if you didn't pull too hard. At first, I thought it might pass, that maybe they'd cool off, take some time, realize they'd overreacted. But days became weeks, then months, and eventually, silence became the new normal. I had to explain to Zoe's caseworker that we wouldn't be including extended family in any of the placement planning. No grandparent visits, no holiday reunification, nothing. She nodded, made a note, and simply said, "Sometimes family isn't safe." That sentence stayed with me. I'd heard it dozens of times in my work, with traumatized kids, with domestic survivors, with parents trying to rewire their pasts. But I'd never realized it could apply to me. My family wasn't safe. Not because they screamed, but because they didn't see. They didn't see Zoe as a human being. They didn't see me as a mother. They didn't see love unless it came wrapped in biology and stamped with approval. I used to think being exiled would destroy me, that I'd be bitter, lonely, resentful, that I'd cry every night over missing birthdays and family reunions and Christmas cards. And yeah, some nights it did sting. But most nights, I looked at Zoe, sleeping in her little bed, surrounded by stuffed animals and night lights and finger-painted stars on the ceiling, and I felt something stronger than sadness. I felt free. They called her a mistake, but loving her, raising her, that was the first thing I ever got completely, beautifully right. You'd think the rejection would have broken me. And for a while, it did. The first few weeks after the fallout were the darkest. I barely slept. I kept checking my phone, waiting for someone, anyone in the family to say they'd overreacted, to tell me they still loved me, even if they didn't understand. But the silence was deafening. There was no apology, no olive branch, no whispered, "I still support you, even if they don't." It was like I'd been scrubbed from the family tree completely, like I had never existed. I cried every night that first month. I mean, ugly, chest-collapsing sobs. Not just for me, but for Zoe. I had this awful fear that maybe I'd stolen something from her, that by choosing a daughter outside of biology, I'd denied her the warmth of a big family. Grandparents, cousins, Sunday dinners, messy Thanksgivings, all of it. I didn't want her to grow up like I had, lonely in a house full of rules. I wanted her to know unconditional love. I wanted her to feel seen. But that version of family, my version of family, had slammed the door on us the moment I chose love over tradition. Still, life had a way of nudging me forward. Day by day, Zoe gave me a reason to get up. She started babbling, laughing, clapping when I entered the room. It's impossible to feel empty when a tiny human lights up just because you walked in. And the more time we spent together, the more I realized kids don't need big families. They don't need perfect houses or curated photo ops. They need something so much simpler, so much more powerful. They need safe. And our home, it was overflowing with it. We made our own traditions. Tuesday night tacos, Saturday pillow forts, random dance parties in the kitchen. I let her paint on the walls of the hallway, little handprints that to anyone else looked messy and chaotic. But to me, it was evidence of joy, of freedom. Zoe called me Mama for the first time on a Wednesday. She was 2. I was making scrambled eggs, and she walked into the kitchen dragging a stuffed elephant, looked up at me with sleepy eyes, and just said it. "Mama." I froze. Not because I didn't expect it, but because I hadn't realized how much I needed it. That one word stitched something together inside me that I didn't even know was still broken. And from that moment on, the title wasn't just something I claimed, it was something I earned. While Zoe grew, I grew too. I went back to school and got certified in art therapy. I started working at a nonprofit that specialized in helping kids from tough backgrounds, abuse, neglect, displacement. The kinds of stories that stayed with you, the kind that Zoe had narrowly escaped becoming. Every day, I helped kids process grief and trauma through painting, sculpture, even coloring. There's something about art. It lets you say the things your mouth can't. I never shared Zoe's story with my clients, but I did share my heart. I understood their silence, their shame, the way they flinched at love because it had hurt them before. And slowly, I started building a reputation in the field, not because I was especially talented, but because I understood. I didn't just talk about healing. I lived it every single day in the little moments that make up a life. Zoe and I became a team. She was quirky, fierce, unapologetically herself, the kind of kid who wore fairy wings to the grocery store and once introduced herself as Queen of Snacks at daycare. She loved dinosaurs and hated bedtime. She liked thunderstorms but was afraid of escalators. And every night, before falling asleep, she asked me to sing the same lullaby, the one I made up that first week I held her. And not once did she ask about the family that had rejected us. To her, I was enough. Still, I'd be lying if I said I never thought about them. I wondered sometimes if they ever talked about me, if my mom regretted choosing the church over her granddaughter, if my sister ever thought about sending a message she never typed, if my dad ever opened a photo album and paused on a picture of us wondering what could have been. I didn't dwell on it, but it lingered, like smoke in a house you can't quite air out. Years passed. I stopped checking their Facebooks, I stopped hoping for holidays, I stopped waiting for apologies that were never coming. Instead, I poured everything into our life. I grew a small garden, I decorated the house with thrift store finds, I let Zoe hang her art gallery in the hallway, which consisted of about 17 stick figure portraits of me with hair that looked like spaghetti. We celebrated small wins like big victories. First day of preschool, cupcakes. Lost her first tooth, we had a picnic in the living room. Said her first big word, determined, after watching a documentary about whales, we turned it into a theme for the week. I learned how to be present, not performative. I learned how to be a mother without needing to prove it to anyone. And just when I thought I'd finally put it all behind me, last summer happened. It was a hot day, Zoe had just turned 5. We were in the backyard planting tomato seedlings, and she was covered in dirt and ladybug stickers. I was kneeling in the garden bed, hair in a messy bun, lost in thought, when I felt my phone buzz in my pocket. A notification, a name I hadn't seen in 5 years. It was my sister. And just like that, all the peace I'd worked so hard for started to shake. I didn't open it right away. My hands were dirty, my heart was racing. I kept hearing my dad's voice, sharp and cold, ringing in my ears. She's not your blood, and she never will be. I looked over at Zoe. She was singing to a worm she found in the soil. And I knew, whatever that message said, whatever storm it was about to bring, I'd be okay. Because this time, I wasn't standing alone. I had a daughter. I had a life. I had roots. And nothing they could say would ever dig those up. There are moments in life where time bends, where one message, one name, one unexpected detail cracks open a door you thought was long sealed shut. This was one of those moments. I was in the backyard, barefoot in the dirt, tugging at a stubborn patch of weeds, while Zoe danced in the sprinkler nearby, shrieking with delight like only a 5-year-old can. Life felt still and simple. The kind of summer afternoon that smelled like wet grass and freedom. Then my phone buzzed. I wiped my hands on my jeans, picked it up, and froze. A text from a number I hadn't seen in 5 years. Dad had a stroke. He can't talk. Please come. They want to meet Zoe. It was my sister. I read it once, then again, and for a second, I genuinely wondered if it was a mistake. Maybe she meant to send it to someone else. Maybe autocorrect turned come into come. Maybe there was some part of this I wasn't understanding. But no, it was clear. Suddenly, they wanted to meet Zoe. The same Zoe they'd called illegitimate. The same daughter they swore wasn't mine. Now that their golden patriarch was vulnerable, voiceless, they remembered we existed. My first instinct was to block her, delete the message, and return to the garden. My second instinct was to laugh, not the happy kind, the tired, bitter kind, the kind of laugh that says, "Are you kidding me with this?" They wanted to meet her? After 5 years of complete silence? After pretending she didn't exist? After damning me for choosing love over blood? I was mid-rant in my own head when I remembered something strange, a small detail that had been sitting in the back of my mind all week, something I had brushed aside, but now it had claws. Just a few days earlier, Zoe's adoption file had arrived in the mail, the final one. Her caseworker had retired, and the state had sent over a sealed manila envelope with all the non-identifiable background they were legally allowed to share now that her case was closed. Most of it was generic, initials, outdated addresses, fragmented timelines. But tucked inside was a copy of a redacted letter. A relative had reached out briefly before disappearing. It didn't contain much, but it listed a name. James D. Whiteley, maternal grandfather, retired Army, no further contact. The name had poked at my memory, but I'd been too busy to dig deeper, until now. I dropped the phone into the grass and ran inside, barefoot and muddy, leaving Zoe giggling outside as I tore through the hall closet. I hadn't opened that particular box in years, the one with my dad's old photos, the one my mom had accidentally left behind when they cut me out like a tumor. Inside were yellowing photo albums, military medals, and one battered green notebook, his old Army scrapbook, a relic from another lifetime. I flipped through page after page of black and white Polaroids and handwritten notes in faded Sharpie. Laughter frozen in time, men in camouflage leaning on jeeps, barbecue parties in base housing, nicknames and crude jokes scrawled on the backs. Then I found it. Jimmy Whiteley, grinning in a photo next to my dad, both of them holding a massive fish like they'd conquered the sea itself. Underneath, in my dad's handwriting, "Me and Jimmy, Oregon boys stick together." My breath caught. Zoe's grandfather was my father's best friend. Suddenly, everything shifted. All those comments from my parents, the intense anger, the performative outrage, the deep, disproportionate shame, it wasn't just because she wasn't blood. It was because she was. They knew. They had to have recognized the name in her file. Even if it wasn't confirmed, they must have heard whispers, seen documents, pieced together the timelines. Army buddies don't disappear quietly. And in a small town like ours, everything leaks eventually. I sat on the floor of the hallway, clutching that photo, shaking from something that wasn't quite anger. It was deeper than that. Grief, maybe. Not just for what I lost, but for what they had thrown away. They could have had a second chance to rewrite the script, to love better, to heal old wounds by supporting something beautiful. But instead, they chose judgment. They chose silence. They chose shame over truth. And now, after a stroke had stolen my father's voice, they wanted mine. The message from my sister kept blinking at the top of my phone screen. They want to meet Zoe. Of course they did, because now the illusion of control had shattered. Now they couldn't pretend everything was perfect. Now they were just people, aging, flawed, and confronted with the consequences of their cruelty. But this wasn't going to be a tidy homecoming. If they wanted to see Zoe, they'd have to face the whole truth. And this time, I would be the one holding the script. I spent the next 2 days thinking, praying, pacing. I consulted Zoe's current caseworker, not because I needed permission, but because I needed clarity. I told her everything, the history, the family, the photo. She listened quietly, nodding, and at the end, she said something I won't forget. Sometimes closure isn't about getting answers. It's about showing up for the last scene of the story, even if you don't like the ending. So, I agreed. Not for them, not for some fairy tale reunion, but for Zoe, so she'd never have to wonder. I packed a bag, I printed the photo of my dad and Jimmy, I folded the caseworker's letter, I prepared Zoe as best I could, telling her we were going to visit some grown-ups who hadn't made kind choices in the past, but might be ready to do better now. And then we drove. 3 hours across the state, through winding highways and dusty farmland, past roadside fruit stands and collapsing barns that looked just like the ones from my childhood. The closer we got, the heavier the air felt. Not because I was afraid. I wasn't. I was ready. But I knew this wouldn't be a gentle conversation. I wasn't the same girl they'd cast out. I wasn't looking for permission or forgiveness. I wasn't hoping to be invited back into the fold. I was arriving on my terms, and if they wanted to meet my daughter, they'd have to meet all of her, including the part that was inconvenient, especially the part that had their fingerprints all over it. There's something surreal about walking into the home you once belonged to and realizing it doesn't recognize you anymore. Everything looked the same. The worn beige couch, the slightly crooked family portraits on the wall, even the smell of coffee and old wood polish. But nothing felt familiar. It was like stepping into a museum exhibit about someone else's life, one you were accidentally part of. The air was thick with tension. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Eyes scanned me, then dropped to Zoe, then quickly looked away, as if acknowledging her too closely might acknowledge everything they'd tried to forget. My mother moved first. Her hug was stiff, arms hesitant and brief, like touching me too long might stain her with something she couldn't wash off. She looked down at Zoe with the same wide-eyed curiosity you'd reserve for an exotic animal at the zoo, beautiful but not quite real. She murmured a short greeting, voice shaky but void of warmth. My sister was next. She crouched a little too close, lips pressed into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Wow, she's big," she said, like it surprised her that 5 years had passed and Zoe hadn't stayed an infant. There was no attempt at connection, just that awkward, brittle tone people use when they want to sound pleasant but have no idea what to say. And my father, my once intimidating, sharp-tongued father, sat sunken in a wheelchair, smaller than I'd ever seen him. Stroke had stolen his voice, but not his presence. He looked at me, then at Zoe, and something flickered in his expression. A flash of recognition, maybe even guilt. But it was too little, too late. The living room was full. Aunts who used to braid my hair, uncles who cracked dry jokes at family dinners, cousins who hadn't bothered to send a text in half a decade. Now, suddenly, they all remembered who I was. I sat Zoe down with a coloring book, handed her a pack of crayons, and stood. I didn't come here to make nice. I came to speak truth. "I want you all to hear something," I said, my voice trembling, not with fear, but with 5 years' worth of restraint, 5 years of being civil in the face of cruelty. I pulled the letter from my bag and read the name slowly, deliberately, so no one could pretend they didn't catch it. James Whiteley, Army, Oregon. Murmurs, raised brows, a shift in the room. My uncle blinked rapidly like he was trying to connect dots he'd been avoiding. And then I dropped it. The truth no one wanted to say aloud. Zoe's biological grandfather was Dad's best friend, and you all knew. Silence hit the room like a vacuum, thick, cold, heavy. Not a single person denied it, because they couldn't. I turned to my mom. Her face had gone pale. "You told me I stole a child," I said quietly. "You told me she wasn't family, but you knew. You knew this wasn't random. You knew she had a connection to us. You just didn't want to deal with it." She started to cry, and for a moment, I almost softened. But then I remembered every night Zoe fell asleep in my arms after asking why she didn't have a grandma. My sister piped up next, voice weak. "We didn't know for sure, Ava. We didn't want to complicate things." Of course not, because complexity is inconvenient. And in their world, if something didn't fit into a neat little narrative, it had to be cut out, no matter who it hurt. I turned and nodded toward the woman seated beside me. She had been silent until now, but I had asked her to come for this moment. "This is Zoe's caseworker." She stood professional and calm and gently explained the facts: that Zoe had been abandoned in the ER, that no one came for her, that the only person who stepped up was me, that I became a mother not by accident but by choice, a choice no one else in this room had the courage to make. As she spoke, I looked at my dad. His hands twitched, his eyes welled up. Maybe he wanted to speak. Maybe he wanted to apologize. Maybe he wished he could. But I wasn't here for his closure. I bent down, kissed Zoe's forehead, and said softly, "We are going now." My mom reached out, desperate. "She's our granddaughter." I stood tall, lifted Zoe's bag, and said, steady and clear, "No, she's my daughter, and you're a stranger." And with that, I turned and walked out, with my head high, my heart full, and my daughter beside me. I walked out of that house the same way I walked in, uninvited but completely in control. There was no screaming, no dramatic meltdown, no tears from me. Just quiet, measured steps and the kind of peace that comes from knowing you finally said everything that needed to be said. Behind me, the room sat in stunned silence, like a stage after the curtain drops. No one knew what to do without their usual script: guilt, shame, manipulation. But none of those worked anymore. Not on me, not on Zoe. As I reached the driveway, one of my cousins hurried after me. The same cousin who hadn't so much as liked a single photo of Zoe in 5 years. She grabbed my arm gently and said, "Please, let us be part of her life." I looked her in the eye and gave her the calmest smile I've probably ever managed in my life. Should have thought about that 5 years ago. It wasn't cruel, it wasn't spiteful, it was just true. We got into the car, Zoe buckled herself in like it was any other errand, like she hadn't just been the center of a quiet storm. And as I started the engine, I caught one last glimpse of that house in the rearview mirror. It didn't look like home, not anymore. And for the first time, that didn't hurt, because I had built a better one with laughter, finger paint, and unconditional love. One where Zoe belonged, one where I did too. I used to think family was a bloodline, a permanent stamp you couldn't escape. But family, real family, it's the people who choose you, who fight for you, who show up when it's hard, not just when it's convenient. And that little girl holding my hand as we walked to the car, she is my family.
Thanks for listening to my story. If you've ever been cut off, betrayed, or made to feel like you had to earn love, hit that like button. Subscribe for more real stories where justice comes full circle. And tell me in the comments, when did you realize you were already enough? Because trust me, you are.